Before we begin tonight's stories, most people think camping horror comes from the woods, from animals, from things watching you in the dark. But the most dangerous nights don't start with screams. They start with rules. Rules meant to keep everyone safe. Rules that sound reasonable. Rules you follow, right up until the moment they turn against you. The stories you're about to hear all happened at campsites. Quiet places, familiar places, places where people trusted silence, authority, and each other. If you were told to stay put until morning, would you listen? Let's begin. I arrived at the campground later than I planned. It was already past sunset when I pulled in. The ranger booth was still open, but the place felt like it was winding down for the night. No kids, no campfires, no voices carrying through the trees. Just that low, hollow quiet you only get far away from highways. The ranger glanced at his screen, then back at me. "Probably just you tonight," he said. He didn't say it in a warning way, more like small talk. Something polite you tell a stranger when there's nothing else to say. I drove deeper into the campground and past two occupied sites. One pickup truck, one older SUV, both dark, no lights on, no movement. I picked a spot farther down, closer to the tree line, where the road narrowed and the campsites felt more spaced out. I remember thinking it was perfect, too perfect maybe, but in a good way. I set up quickly, tent, cooler, lantern, everything by muscle memory. I'd camped enough times to know how to do it without thinking. The air was still, no wind, no insects. Even the forest felt paused. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed the restroom building light turn on. It wasn't close to my sight, but it was visible through the trees. A soft yellow glow, steady and calm. I assumed someone else had gone in, maybe the people from the pickup truck. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear doors. But sound travels strangely at night, and I didn't think much of it. The light stayed on for about 15 minutes. Then it turned off. Cleanly. No flicker. No delay. I checked my phone out of habit. 10:15 p.m. Quiet hours started at 10. That made sense. Someone finishing up before bed. Normal campground routine. I crawled into my tent not long after, zipped it up, turned off my lantern, let the darkness settle. That was when I realized how quiet it really was. Not peaceful quiet, not relaxing quiet, just empty. No cars pulling in, no doors closing, no distant laughter or radios. Even the usual nighttime sounds felt muted, like the volume had been turned down across the entire place. I lay there longer than I expected, listening. At exactly 10 o'clock the next night, the restroom light came on again. I remember that part clearly, because I was already awake, and I was already watching that spot through the trees. And because for some reason I knew, before I checked the time, that it would be on schedule. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself places like this ran on timers. Still, I stayed awake longer than I needed to, just listening. Just counting minutes, just waiting for the light to turn off. I woke up later than I meant to. The light outside my tent had already shifted from gray to something brighter. Morning in the campground came quietly, without any of the usual signs that people were waking up nearby. No doors opening, no engines starting, no voices drifting through the trees. I sat up and listened for a while before unzipping the tent. Nothing. The air was still the same way it had been the night before. Even during the day, the place felt paused, like it was waiting for something to happen. I walked toward the restroom building with my phone in my hand, mostly out of habit, mostly because I wanted to confirm it was actually there and not something I'd imagined in the dark. It looked normal in the daylight. Concrete walls, a faded park sign, one small window near the roof, no lights on inside. No signs of anyone having used it recently. On the way back, I passed the two campsites I'd noticed the night before. They were empty. No tents, no coolers, no fire rings with warm ash, not even trash bags tied to posts, the way people usually leave when they head out early. It looked like no one had stayed there at all. I checked the gravel for tire tracks. There were some, but they were old, faded. Hard to tell when they'd been made. Nothing fresh enough to explain two vehicles leaving sometime during the night. That was the first moment something felt off. Not scary, just confusing. I went back to my site and made coffee, sat on the edge of the picnic table and watched the trees. Every now and then, I'd glance toward the restroom building, half expecting to see someone walk out. No one did. Around mid-morning, I walked to the registration board near the entrance. It was a simple setup, a corkboard under a small roof, a map of the campground, a plastic sleeve holding the sign-in sheet. I scanned down the list of names. Mine was there, written in the same pen I always carried, same handwriting. Below it, nothing. No check-ins after me, no arrivals late in the night, no one signed in that morning. I stood there longer than I needed to, reading the same names again and again, like they might change if I looked away. By early afternoon, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. People leave early. Campgrounds thin out fast when the weather turns. None of it meant anything on its own. That night I stayed up later, not because I was scared, because I was paying attention. I turned off my lantern and sat in the dark, watching the trees and the thin path leading to the restroom building. At exactly 10 o'clock, the light came on. Same soft yellow glow, same steady brightness. I checked my phone without thinking. 10 p.m. The light stayed on for 15 minutes, then it shut off. I waited for footsteps. I waited for a door. I waited for anything that would explain it. There was nothing, just the light doing exactly what it had done the night before, on schedule. And for the first time, I wondered why I hadn't heard anyone use it at all. I told myself I would leave the next morning. That was the plan I settled on sometime after midnight, lying awake and staring at the faint outline of the trees beyond my tent. Whatever was going on, it wasn't worth another night. I didn't need answers. I didn't need proof. I just needed to be somewhere else. But when morning came, things felt normal. The sun was out. The campground looked ordinary again. Quiet, yes, but no more than you'd expect on a weekday this late in the season. I packed slowly, made breakfast, checked my phone. No missed calls, no strange notifications, nothing to suggest the previous night had been anything more than coincidence. By late afternoon, the weather shifted. Dark clouds rolled in faster than the forecast had suggested. The air cooled. The wind picked up just enough to make the trees creak in a way that sounded like distant movement. I checked the map on my phone and realized the road out of the campground wound through several miles of forest before reconnecting with the highway. I didn't like the idea of driving it after dark. I told myself I'd leave in the morning instead. It was a reasonable decision, the kind you make without thinking twice. That night, I changed my routine. I ate earlier, cleaned up before sunset, made sure everything was put away before quiet hours started. When 10 o'clock came around, I was already inside my tent, zipped in, with my lantern turned off. I didn't plan on watching the restroom building, I just did. The light came on at 9:55 p.m. I froze. Not because the light was on, because it was early. I checked my phone immediately, 9:55 p.m., 5 minutes sooner than the nights before. I stayed still, listening. The campground was silent. No footsteps, no doors, no sound of gravel shifting under shoes. Just the steady glow of the light through the trees, unchanged. At 10 o'clock, nothing happened. The light stayed on. It remained that way for 15 minutes. Then it shut off at 10:10, 5 minutes earlier than usual. I lay there, replaying it in my head, trying to find a reason that didn't feel ridiculous. Timers drift, systems glitch, old parks use outdated equipment. None of it meant anything on its own. Still, I didn't sleep. The next day, I walked back to the restroom building in the afternoon. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the door. There was no sign explaining the lights, no motion sensor that I could see, no switch inside the open window, just a plain metal door and a light fixture mounted above it. On my way back to the campsite, I noticed something else. My footprints from that morning were still visible in the dirt. They hadn't been disturbed. No other tracks crossed them. No signs of anyone else moving around at all. That night, I stayed awake again. Not out of fear, out of anticipation. At 9:50 p.m., I was already watching. At 9:55, the light came on, exactly when it had the night before. I didn't check my phone this time. I didn't need to, because by then, I wasn't wondering if the light was on a timer anymore. I was wondering why it seemed to know when I was awake. I decided to stop reacting to it. Up until then, everything I'd done had been instinctive. Watching the light, checking the time, lying awake and trying to make sense of patterns that didn't want to be explained. It occurred to me that as long as I kept responding to it, whatever it was would keep adjusting. So I changed things. That afternoon, I forced myself to act normal. I took a short hike on one of the nearby trails. I spoke out loud a few times, just to hear a human voice. I even nodded to the empty air like someone might be watching, which felt ridiculous the moment I did it. I made dinner later than usual. I kept my lantern on past sunset. I didn't zip my tent right away. By the time quiet hours started, I was still sitting outside, scrolling on my phone, pretending I wasn't paying attention to the restroom building at all. When 10 o'clock came, the light didn't turn on. That should have reassured me. Instead, my stomach tightened. I waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Nothing. I told myself I'd been right, that there was no pattern, that I'd imagined the whole thing because the campground was empty and my brain needed something to focus on. I crawled into my tent just after 10:15. I turned off my lantern. I lay back and stared at the dark fabric ceiling above me. At 10:17 p.m., the restroom light came on. Not bright, not steady, just on. I checked my phone once, 10:17. It stayed on longer than it ever had before. There was no 15-minute window this time, no clean shutoff, no sense of routine. The light remained, unchanged, like it was waiting for something. For me, I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, I realized my breathing had slowed to match the quiet around me. Slow, careful, measured. That was when it hit me. The light hadn't turned on when quiet hours started. It had turned on when I went to sleep. The realization sat in my chest, heavy and undeniable. I wasn't observing it anymore. I was part of the schedule. I left before sunrise. I didn't pack carefully. I didn't check anything twice. I folded the tent the wrong way and shoved it into the trunk without fixing it. The campground was still dark, the sky just beginning to lighten behind the trees. As I drove toward the exit, I passed the restroom building one last time. The light was on. It was 5:32 a.m. There was no reason for it to be on. Quiet hours hadn't ended yet. No one was awake. No cars had pulled in during the night. The building stood exactly as it had before, unchanged, except for that steady yellow glow. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. Once I reached the highway, the sense of pressure in my chest eased, but it didn't disappear. It followed me for miles, sitting just beneath my breathing, like I'd forgotten something important and couldn't remember what it was. I didn't stop for breakfast. I didn't stop at another campground. I drove until the trees thinned and the road felt wide and exposed again. For a while after that trip, I told myself it hadn't affected me. But small things changed. I stopped sleeping with the lights off. I kept my phone screen on beside the bed, even when I wasn't using it. When I stayed somewhere unfamiliar, I learned the schedules first. Check-in times, quiet hours, when lights turned on and off. And I avoided places that felt too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that seems organized. Sometimes, late at night, I still catch myself watching the time, waiting, just to make sure nothing adjusts to me anymore. I chose that spot because it was far from everything. The campground wasn't marked or maintained, just a wide clearing off a dirt road, the kind of place people used when they didn't want neighbors. When I pulled in, I slowed down on purpose, scanning the area, counting how many places someone could park without being close to anyone else. There were plenty. That was the point. I drove past one vehicle parked near the entrance, then another, much farther out, closer to the trees. Both were spaced out. Both felt respectful. I kept going until I found a stretch of ground that was open on all sides, with a clear path back to the road. Room to breathe, room to leave. I parked, cut the engine, and listened. Nothing. No voices, no radios, no engines idling in the distance, just wind moving through dry grass and the ticking sound of my hood cooling down. I set up my tent slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to stay aware of what was happening around me. I made sure the door faced the open clearing, not the trees. I placed my cooler a few feet away, where I could see it easily. Everything felt intentional. As the light faded, I noticed headlights moving slowly along the dirt road behind me. They passed once, then again. The vehicle didn't stop, just rolled through at a careful pace, like the driver was deciding where to settle. I watched until the headlights disappeared behind a low rise, then went back to what I was doing. A few minutes later, the engine sound returned. This time, the headlights stopped. Too close. They were angled toward my tent, washing the fabric in pale light. I stood there for a second, waiting for the engine to shut off. It didn't. The car idled, quiet, steady. There was no reason for it to be there. Not when there was so much open space. Not when they could have parked anywhere else without being near me at all. Eventually, the headlights clicked off. The engine stayed on. I could see the outline of the vehicle now, an older SUV, nothing distinctive, no stickers, no roof rack, just a shape sitting where it didn't need to be. I waited for a door to open. Nothing happened. No one got out. No voices. No footsteps crunching on gravel. The engine shut off a few moments later. Still no movement. I told myself they were just settling in. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they didn't realize how close they'd parked. It was a free campground. No rules. No assigned spaces. Still, I found myself checking the distance between my tent and their front bumper. It was close enough that if I took a few steps forward, I could touch it. I didn't like that. I stepped back into my tent and zipped the door halfway, leaving just enough space to watch the clearing. The sun finished setting, the clearing went dark, and the space that had felt open and safe an hour earlier suddenly felt much smaller. I stayed still for a while, listening. Nothing happened. No doors opened, no voices. The SUV just sat there, dark and quiet, close enough that I could hear the metal ticking as it cooled. I told myself it wasn't a threat. People park badly all the time, especially in places without lines or rules. Maybe they thought they were farther away than they actually were. Maybe they didn't notice my tent until it was too late to move again. I waited a few more minutes, then unzipped the tent and stepped out. I kept my hands visible. No sudden movements, just enough light from my headlamp to see where I was going. I didn't aim it at their windshield. The driver's window rolled down halfway. A man's voice came out, calm and casual. "Hey," he said. "Sorry if we're close." That alone should have eased things. It didn't. He sounded too relaxed, like this was exactly how he expected the interaction to go. I nodded and said it was fine, that I was just making sure everything was okay. I mentioned there was plenty of room farther down the clearing if they wanted more space. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "We're good here," he said. The tone was polite, friendly even. No challenge in it. I smiled, the way you do when you don't want to escalate something small into something awkward. I said I understood. Free campground, no assigned spots. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked as casually as I could if they'd just arrived. "Not exactly," he said. I waited for him to explain. He didn't. I shifted my weight and laughed softly, trying to keep the mood light. I asked if they needed anything. Water, a lighter, directions. "No," he said. "We're all set." I started to step back, relieved that the conversation was ending without tension. Before I could turn away, he added something. "We can't park anywhere else." He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Calm, matter of fact, almost apologetic. I paused. I looked past him, scanning the open ground behind the SUV. Even in the low light, I could see dozens of places they could have parked instead. Wide, flat, empty. I nodded anyway. "Got it," I said. I didn't ask why. I went back to my tent and zipped it closed. Inside, the air felt warmer, smaller. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my head. The words themselves weren't threatening. Nothing he'd said crossed a line. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just agreed to something I didn't fully understand. Outside, the SUV stayed exactly where it was, close enough to feel intentional. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound felt closer than it should have. The cooling metal of the SUV, a soft shift, like someone adjusting in their seat, the faint click of a door lock engaging. Nothing sharp enough to react to, just enough to keep me alert. At some point, I realized I needed to see the rest of the clearing for myself. Not because I didn't believe him, because if there really was nowhere else to park, I needed to understand why. I waited until the headlights on the distant road disappeared. Then I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out, keeping my headlamp angled down. The ground changed as soon as I moved away from my sight. What had looked flat from a distance wasn't. The dirt dipped and sloped in shallow waves, uneven enough that a vehicle would lean at an uncomfortable angle. I tested a few spots with my boot. The soil crumbled under my weight, soft and sandy, the kind that swallows tires if you stop too long. Farther out, a shallow wash cut across the clearing. Dry now, but wide enough to catch an axle. Rocks lined the edges where rain had torn through before. Beyond that, the ground rose again, littered with loose stones. I kept walking. Every option I'd assumed was open wasn't. Either too soft, too sloped, too narrow to turn around safely in the dark. By the time I circled back, my headlamp beam landed on the space beside my tent, the spot where the SUV was parked. It was the only section of ground that stayed level, packed hard, clear of rocks, wide enough to pull in and pull out without risk. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to the quiet and feeling it press in around me. They hadn't chosen that spot. They'd needed it. As I turned back toward my tent, the SUV's interior light flicked on briefly, just long enough to remind me they were awake. The light shut off again. No door opened. No one spoke. I climbed back into my tent and zipped it closed. Inside, the space felt tighter than before. The clearing hadn't changed, but my understanding of it had. If they had to be there, then one of us would eventually have to move. I didn't sleep after that. Not because I thought they were going to do something, but because every position I lay in reminded me how little space I actually had. The tent felt thinner. The air felt heavier, like the clearing itself had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. I kept replaying the math in my head. If they needed that spot, and I was the only reason they couldn't fully use it, then the problem wasn't them. It was me. I checked my phone. No signal. The time crawled forward in slow, uneven steps. Midnight passed, then 1. The SUV never moved. No doors opened, no voices. Just the occasional soft creak of suspension when someone inside shifted their weight. Around 2 in the morning, I unzipped the tent an inch and looked out. The SUV sat exactly where it had been, close enough that I could make out the outline of the front grille in the dark, close enough that if I tripped stepping out, I'd fall toward it. I thought about moving my tent. The idea didn't last long. Packing up in the dark meant turning on lights, making noise, standing exposed in the only flat stretch of ground for yards. I imagined the zipper sound carrying through the clearing, the rustle of fabric, the pause that would follow. I imagined them watching, so I stayed where I was. That was when I realized how completely the situation had flipped. Earlier, I'd chosen this place because it gave me options. Now, the only option left was to wait. Sometime before dawn, I noticed the SUV's engine turn over briefly. Just a quiet click, then silence again, like someone checking that it still worked. I held my breath without meaning to. Minutes passed. Nothing else happened. The engine didn't start again. The vehicle didn't move. But the message was clear enough. They weren't stuck. They were ready. And I was the one who wasn't going anywhere. I left as soon as there was enough light to see the ground. I didn't wait for the sun to clear the horizon. I didn't make coffee. I packed the tent in silence, moving slowly, deliberately, as if sudden motions might change something I couldn't see yet. The SUV didn't move. It stayed where it was, engine off, windows dark, close enough that I could feel its presence without looking at it. I kept my eyes on the ground while I worked. When everything was finally loaded, I stood for a moment with my keys in my hand, listening. Nothing. I walked to my car, opened the door, and sat inside without starting it right away. My heart was beating faster than it should have for a simple departure. Before pulling away, I glanced toward the SUV. It hadn't shifted. No doors open, no lights, no sign of anyone watching. I drove out of the clearing without looking back again. Only when the dirt road smoothed out and the trees thinned did I realize how tense my body had been. My shoulders ached. My jaw hurt from clenching it through the night. I didn't stop until I reached pavement. Later that day, the details began to bother me in ways they hadn't before. The way the driver had said they couldn't park anywhere else. The way the spot beside my tent had been prepared without my noticing. The way the ground around it showed older tire marks, pressed deep into the dirt. Marks that hadn't been made that night. I told myself it meant nothing, that people camped there often, that I'd just been unlucky with timing. Still, the thought stayed with me. Now, when I camp, I don't choose places because they're open. I choose them because they have exits. I don't trust clearings that look wide and forgiving. I look for ground that forces distance. Places where no one can quietly take the space beside me without effort. And if someone ever parks too close again, even if they're polite, even if they apologize, even if they tell me they have no other choice, I won't wait to find out what that really means. I trusted him because he spoke in rules. I arrived at the campground just before dusk, the kind of place that still had posted regulations and a small host booth, but no crowds. A few sites were taken. Most were empty. The air smelled like cold dirt and pine, the way it does before weather turns. I picked a spot near the edge of the loop. It sat slightly higher than the rest, with a clear view back to the road. I liked that. If something went wrong, I could leave without thinking. I was halfway through setting up my tent when a man walked over from the direction of the booth. He wore an old jacket with a patch sewn onto the sleeve. Not crisp, not official looking, just familiar enough to register as legitimate. A radio hung at his hip. It crackled once, then went quiet. "Evening," he said. "You're going to want to move." He said it the way people do when they're trying to help. I asked why. "That area floods overnight," he said, nodding toward my site. "Happens fast. Looks dry now, but it won't stay that way." He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture dramatically. He sounded practiced, like he'd said the same thing many times before. I looked around. The ground was dry, firm, no signs of standing water, but clouds were stacking low over the trees, thick and dark. "Where should I go?" I asked. He pointed farther into the campground, past the loop, past where the trees grew closer together. "There's a spot back there," he said. "Lower traffic, more sheltered. Safer if the weather turns. Safer." He used the word casually, like it was obvious. I hesitated. I told him I'd checked the forecast, that nothing was supposed to hit until morning. He smiled, just slightly. "Forecasts don't see everything," he said. "Trust me." That should have been the moment I questioned it. Instead, I nodded. I didn't ask his name. I didn't ask how long he'd been working there. I didn't ask why no one else was being moved. He waited while I packed up. Didn't rush me. Didn't watch too closely. Just stood there, hands in his pockets, radio silent at his side. When I finished, he walked ahead of me, guiding the way. The new spot sat lower than my original one, tucked in near a line of trees. The road narrowed there, the dirt darker and softer under my tires. I parked where he indicated and stepped out. "This'll keep you dry," he said. "Stay put tonight." Then he turned and walked back toward the booth without another word. I stood there for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade. The place felt quieter than before, not calmer, just farther away from everything. The change in weather didn't announce itself. There was no rain at first, no thunder, just a slow drop in temperature and a steady wind pushing through the trees, bending them in the same direction. My original site was still visible through gaps in the branches, higher and more open than where I was now. I tried not to think about it. I finished setting up in the new spot as the light faded. The ground felt different under my boots, softer. When I pressed down near one tire, the dirt gave slightly, then settled again. I told myself that was normal. Soil changes closer to the trees. By the time I zipped the tent, it was fully dark. The wind picked up not long after. Not strong enough to be dangerous, but persistent. It pushed against the tent walls and carried the smell of damp earth. Somewhere nearby, branches rubbed together with a slow, uneven rhythm. I checked the weather again. Still nothing urgent. Still clear until morning. I was sitting on my sleeping pad when the radio crackled. It wasn't loud, just a short burst of static, then a voice I recognized. "Wind's shifting," the camp host said, somewhere out there in the dark. "Best to stay put tonight." I didn't know how he knew I was awake. I didn't respond. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the road, slow, unhurried. They stopped somewhere behind my tent, far enough away that I couldn't see him, close enough that I could tell he wasn't wearing heavy boots. "You're good back here," he said. "Ground holds better." I thought about asking him to explain. Instead, I asked how bad the flooding usually got. "Bad enough," he said. "People underestimate it." The footsteps moved away. The sound faded toward the booth. I lay back and tried to relax, but the tent floor felt colder than before. When I shifted my weight, there was a faint, wet sound beneath me, like fabric brushing against damp soil. I unzipped the tent slightly and shined my light outside. The dirt around the edge of the tent was darker now, not soaked, just changed. The kind of color it takes on when water has been there recently, even if it's gone now. I told myself that was what he'd warned me about. The wind kept pushing. The trees creaked louder. Somewhere farther down the campground, something metallic rattled and then went still. I looked toward my old site one more time. From here, it seemed higher than before, safer. I turned my light off and lay still, listening. If he was right, staying put was the smart choice. If he was wrong, I'd already followed his advice once, and I didn't know how many more chances I had to get it right. The rain started after midnight. Not hard, not dramatic. Just a steady, patient fall that soaked into the ground without making much noise. The wind died down, replaced by the sound of water tapping against fabric and leaves. I woke up cold. The sleeping pad felt thinner beneath me. When I shifted my weight, the floor of the tent sagged slightly, like the ground underneath had softened more than it should have. I reached for my boots and pressed my heel down near the entrance. The dirt gave way. Not a lot, just enough to notice. I unzipped the tent and shined my light outside. A shallow channel of water had formed a few feet away, slowly widening as rain fed into it from higher ground. It wasn't rushing, it wasn't deep, but it was moving toward me. I looked back toward my original site. Even in the dark, I could tell the difference. The ground there was higher. The rain pooled and ran off instead of settling. My headlights would have cleared the path easily if I'd stayed. I thought about moving the tent. The idea lasted only a few seconds. Packing meant standing in the rain, turning on lights, dragging gear uphill in the dark, across ground I couldn't fully see anymore. One wrong step, and I'd be sliding instead of walking. I reached for my phone. No signal. The radio crackled again before I could turn my light off. "Water's coming in from the north," the camp host said. "You don't want to move right now." I didn't ask how he knew. I asked if it was safe to stay. There was a pause, just long enough to notice. "It's safer than moving," he said. "Trust me." The words landed heavier this time. I zipped the tent closed and sat there, listening as the rain soaked deeper into the ground. The channel outside widened. The floor beneath me felt colder, wetter. At some point, the water reached the edge of the tent. Not enough to flood it, just enough to soak the ground beneath my bag. I told myself it would stop, that the rain would pass, that he knew what he was talking about. Then I felt the ground shift, not collapse, just settle. A slow, almost gentle movement, like the earth adjusting under weight. I held my breath. Outside, the rain kept falling, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I understood exactly how trapped I was. I waited until the rain eased, not stopped, just softened enough that the sound no longer filled the entire world. The ground beneath me was saturated now. When I shifted my weight, water pressed up through the fabric floor and soaked into my clothes. Staying wasn't an option anymore. I zipped the tent open and stepped outside. My boots sank immediately, mud swallowing the soles and releasing them with a wet pull when I lifted my feet. The shallow channel had widened into something more defined, water sliding past my sight with slow determination. I aimed my light uphill toward my original spot. The path back looked steeper than I remembered. The dirt was slick, uneven, cut through by small streams that hadn't been there before. One misstep and I'd slide instead of climb. Behind me, the radio crackled. "You don't want to try that now," the camp host said. His voice was calm, close enough that it carried clearly through the rain. "People get hurt that way." I turned in a slow circle, scanning the darkness. "Where are you?" I asked. "Doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is staying alive." I thought about the tent, about leaving everything behind and just making a run for the car. The keys were in my pocket. The engine would start. The tires might grip long enough to get me out. "Mud'll take you sideways," he said, like he'd read the thought. "You'll end up stuck." I didn't know how he could see me, or if he even needed to. The water reached my ankles, cold, steady, unhurried. I backed toward the tent, heart pounding, every instinct screaming that I was losing time I couldn't afford. The radio crackled again, softer this time. "I told you to move before dark," he said. "This is why." Anger flared through the fear. I asked him why he'd sent me here, why he hadn't warned me how bad it could get. There was a pause. "Because this is the safer place," he said. "Just not for everyone." The meaning settled in slowly, like the water around my feet. Safer, for him. I retreated into the tent and zipped it shut, hands shaking. The ground shifted again beneath me, more noticeably this time. Mud slid, water surged. I sat there, soaked and shaking, realizing the choice I'd been trying to avoid was already made. I wasn't deciding where to go anymore. I was deciding how long I could stay alive where I was. I don't remember falling asleep. What I remember is waking up to silence. The rain had stopped, not gradually, completely. The kind of quiet that follows a storm when everything has already settled into its new shape. The tent floor was soaked through. My clothes were damp and heavy. The water outside had dropped back into shallow channels, leaving behind slick mud and debris pressed flat against the ground. I unzipped the tent and stepped out carefully. The clearing looked wrong. The ground around my site had shifted overnight, small ridges where water had cut through, fresh gouges in the dirt where mud had slid and stopped. If I'd tried to run uphill in the dark, I would have lost my footing within a few steps. My original site was untouched, dry, firm, higher than everything around it. I walked back toward the booth with slow, careful steps, expecting to see the camp host there, expecting him to say something, to explain, to finish whatever warning he'd started. The booth was dark, no radio, no jacket, no sign that anyone had been there recently. The door was locked. Dust lay undisturbed across the threshold. Later that morning, a ranger drove through. I told him what had happened, about being told to move, about the flooding, about the man with the radio. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he shook his head. "We don't move campers at night," he said, "and we don't have a host assigned here." I asked if anyone else had reported flooding. "No," he said, "this area drains fast." I didn't stay long after that. Weeks later, I looked it up out of curiosity. Accident reports, news articles, anything about that campground. There were a few. Campers injured after following incorrect safety advice. Vehicles stuck overnight in flooded clearings. One brief mention of a fatality years earlier. No names, no photos, just locations. Now, when I camp, I don't trust uniforms. I don't trust radios. And I don't trust anyone who tells me to move without showing me where they'll be when things go wrong. Because sometimes, the most dangerous place isn't where you are. It's where someone with authority tells you you'll be safer. We chose that campsite because it had an emergency call box. There was no cell service anywhere along that stretch of road. The map warned us about it, and the ranger station we passed earlier made it clear we were on our own once we turned off the highway. Normally, that would have been a deal breaker, but on the campground sign, right beneath the rules about fires and quiet hours, there was a small line that changed everything. Emergency call box available. The campsite sat deeper in the trees than the others. Quiet, isolated. The kind of place people picked when they wanted to feel far away without actually being unsafe. The metal call box stood near the trailhead, bolted to a thick wooden post. A faded instruction label was still visible. For emergencies, lift handset. I remember touching it as we walked past, more out of curiosity than concern. The metal felt cold, solid, reassuring. Even without signal, we weren't really alone. We set up camp before sunset. The air was calm, the sky clear enough that stars were already starting to show between the branches. Nothing about the place felt wrong. No strange sounds, no warnings, just the usual forest noise settling in for the night. Later, while gathering firewood, I noticed the call box light was on. Not bright, just a dull amber glow behind scratched plastic. It flickered once, then steadied. I assumed that was normal, a battery indicator maybe, something meant to show it was working. I joked that it was good to know help was close if we needed it. No one laughed. As the fire burned down and the campground went quiet, my eyes kept drifting back to that faint light in the distance. It didn't move, didn't change, just stayed on, marking the one place we were supposed to go if something went wrong. Before turning in, I walked over and lifted the handset. There was a tone, a low, steady hum that sounded like a line waiting to be answered. I held it there for a second, then hung it back up. "It works," I said, mostly to myself. I went back to the tent feeling lighter than I should have. If anything happened, we knew exactly where to go. That belief was the reason we stayed. I noticed the damage the next morning. In daylight, the call box didn't look as reassuring as it had the night before. The metal housing was scratched deeper on one side, like something hard had been dragged across it more than once. The plastic cover over the light was clouded, not just with age, but with fine cracks that caught the sun at certain angles. Someone had pressed on it. Hard. I lifted the handset again. The tone came back immediately. The same low hum. No ringing, no voice. Just the sound of a connection waiting for someone on the other end. I held it longer this time. Nothing changed. When I set it back, I noticed the cord didn't retract all the way. It hung loose for a second before settling, twisted slightly, like it had been pulled too far before. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. It was easier to assume wear and tear, old equipment, remote campground. Things break out here and don't get fixed right away. Still, the idea followed me through the morning. We went about the day normally. Short hike, late lunch, back to camp before the light shifted. The call box stayed in my peripheral vision the entire time. Its dull amber light still on, even in full daylight. That didn't feel right. In the afternoon, I walked over again and checked the instruction label. The edges were peeled back, the adhesive underneath darkened, as if it had been wet repeatedly. Under the printed text, faint marks showed through the metal. Scratches, short, uneven. They weren't random. They clustered around the area beneath the handset, right where someone's fingers would grip if they were panicking. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet the campground was. No cars passed. No voices carried through the trees. The other sites were empty enough that sound didn't travel far at all. I picked up the handset one more time. "This is an emergency," I said, feeling foolish the moment the words left my mouth. The line stayed open. No response. No click. No acknowledgement that anyone had heard me. Just the hum. I hung it up and stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the box. It wasn't broken. It was waiting. And for the first time since we arrived, I wondered who had been desperate enough to use it before us, and why no one had come. The accident happened just after dark. We'd gone down to the creek to rinse off dishes before turning in. The trail was short, familiar enough that we hadn't bothered with headlamps yet. The last of the light was still clinging to the treetops, turning everything beneath them into shadow. I heard the slip before I heard the fall. A sharp scrape, a sudden intake of breath, then a sound I didn't recognize at first. Bone hitting rock harder than it should. By the time I reached them, they were on the ground, one leg twisted at an angle that made my stomach drop. They tried to move it once, out of reflex, and then stopped immediately. "Don't," I said, kneeling beside them. My voice sounded too calm for what I was seeing. They were shaking, not from cold, from shock. We got them back to camp slowly, too slowly. Every step took effort, breath, focus. By the time we reached the clearing, full darkness had settled in. The call box light was the only steady thing left, glowing through the trees like a marker we'd been aiming for the entire time. I lifted the handset with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. There was the tone again, the same low hum, unchanged. "This is an emergency," I said, louder this time, clearer. I gave our location, described the injury, said the words I'd practiced in my head for situations like this. Nothing answered me. I stayed on the line, waiting for anything. A click, a voice, even a recording. The hum continued. Behind me, they groaned softly and went quiet again. I hung up and slammed the handset back into place harder than I meant to. The cord jerked and twisted, then went slack. I tried again. Same tone, same silence. Minutes passed, then more. The call box light flickered once, dimmed, then steadied. I realized I'd been assuming help would come just because I'd done what I was supposed to do. Because I'd lifted the handset. Because I'd followed the instructions. I knelt there in the dirt, the handset pressed to my ear, listening to the sound of nothing happening, and understood what the scratches meant. Whoever had used this before hadn't given up quickly. They'd stayed right here, waiting, just like I was now. Time stopped behaving the way it should have. Minutes stretched without changing anything. The night stayed still, the forest holding its breath, as if sound itself might make things worse. I checked my watch again and again, expecting it to jump forward, to prove that something was happening somewhere else. Nothing did. The person on the ground was getting quieter. At first they asked questions, small ones, repetitive ones. What time it was, whether anyone was coming, whether they should try to move their leg. I answered each time, keeping my voice steady, even when the answers didn't change. Then the questions stopped. I wrapped them in every spare layer we had. Jackets, blankets. The ground beneath them was cold now, pulling heat away faster than I could replace it. I pressed my hand against theirs to keep them awake, counting breaths the way I'd once been taught. I went back to the call box. The light was still on. I lifted the handset again, not expecting anything different, and said nothing at all this time. I just listened. The hum was softer now, uneven, like the line was tired. I tried shaking the handset, I tried pressing it tighter against my ear. I tried speaking again, slower, clearer, as if volume had been the problem all along. No one answered. That was when I noticed something new. The ground directly beneath the call box was worn smooth, not by weather, by feet. A shallow depression where dirt had been pressed down again and again, forming a place someone could stand for a long time, waiting. I stepped back and nearly lost my footing on something hard. A small object lay half buried in the mud near the post. I brushed it off with my sleeve. A broken phone. The screen was shattered, the case cracked along one edge. It looked old, but not ancient. The kind someone might still carry if they didn't camp often. There was no signal out here. They would have known that, which meant whoever dropped it had been desperate enough to try anyway. I looked back toward the tent. The person inside hadn't moved. I made a decision then, not a good one, just the only one left. I was going to leave them for a few minutes and try to reach the road. It was a long walk in the dark, but if I could get even a single bar of signal, it would be enough. I didn't tell them where I was going. I didn't want them counting the seconds. As I stepped away, the call box light flickered again. For the first time since we arrived, it went out completely. The forest went darker than it had any right to be. And I realized the worst part wasn't that help wasn't coming. It was that whatever had happened here before had ended the same way. I don't know how long I walked before I saw the road. The forest thinned gradually, the ground rising and falling beneath my feet in uneven waves. Every few steps I stopped and listened, half expecting to hear my name carried through the trees. The night stayed empty. No engines, no voices, just my own breathing, loud and wrong in my ears. When I finally reached the pavement, it felt unreal, like stepping into a different world that hadn't noticed what was happening just a mile away. I got a signal almost immediately. The call went through on the first ring. By the time emergency services arrived, the sky was already starting to lighten. They moved quickly, efficiently, calm in the way people are when they do this for a living. I followed them back into the campground, answering questions, pointing the way, replaying the night in fragments that didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore. They worked on my friend for a long time, long enough that I stopped checking the time. Later, someone told me they'd made it, not without complications, not without consequences, but alive. That was supposed to be the end of it. Before we left, I walked back to the call box one last time. The light was off. The handset hung in place, clean and undamaged, as if it had never been touched. The scratches I'd noticed before were still there, but they looked older now, worn in, part of the metal. A ranger met me there. I asked him how long the call box had been out of service. He frowned and checked his radio. "It's been disconnected for years," he said. "We keep it up because people feel better seeing it." I didn't ask what he meant by that. As we drove away, I looked back once through the trees. The call box was already hard to see, just another shape blending into the forest. I still think about the person who used it before us, about how long they waited, about the sound they heard on the line while they stood there, believing help was closer than it really was. Sometimes, when I pass one on the highway or near a trailhead, I catch myself slowing down, just to make sure it isn't still glowing. We agreed on one rule before we ever left the parking lot. No one gets left behind. It wasn't dramatic, no speeches, just something we all nodded at while tightening straps and checking packs. We'd been friends long enough to trust each other and experienced enough to know that things go wrong in the backcountry faster than people expect. There were 5 of us. Everyone carried their share. Food was split evenly. Water filters, first aid kit, satellite map. Nothing fancy, nothing reckless. The plan was simple. Hike in before sunset, camp 2 nights, hike out the same way we came. The trailhead disappeared behind us within the first hour. Trees closed in. The sound of the road faded until there was nothing but boots on dirt and breath moving through cool air. I felt good that day. Not the strongest in the group, but not the weakest either. I'd trained. I'd packed light. I wasn't worried about slowing anyone down. We reached the campsite in the late afternoon, a flat clearing near a bend in the trail, sheltered from wind, close to a water source. The kind of spot you feel lucky to find. We set up quickly, moving around each other without getting in the way. Everything worked the way it was supposed to. As the light dropped, the temperature followed. Jackets came out. Someone started boiling water. Someone else joked about how quiet it was out there. I remember thinking how good it felt to be with people I trusted, that far from everything else. That night, nothing happened. No arguments, no strange noises, no signs that the next day would be any different from what we'd planned. We went to sleep believing the hard part was already over. That was when the rules still meant something. The problem didn't show up all at once. It started as a tightness in my calf a few miles into the second day. Nothing sharp, nothing dramatic. The kind of ache you notice and ignore because you felt it before and it always passes. I adjusted my stride and kept going. By late morning, the trail narrowed and the ground grew uneven. Roots crossed at odd angles. Loose stones shifted underfoot. The pace slowed naturally and no one complained. We were still on schedule, still comfortable. Then my foot slipped. I caught myself before I went down, but the jolt ran straight up my leg. The tightness flared into something hotter, deeper. I stopped walking without thinking, bending forward with my hands on my knees. "You good?" someone asked. "Yeah," I said too quickly. "Just need a minute." They waited. No sighs, no eye rolls. Water bottles came out. Someone checked the map. It felt normal, supportive. When we started again, I could keep up, but only if I focused. Every step needed attention. I tested the ground before committing weight. The trail climbed, and my breathing grew louder than everyone else's. We took our first real break earlier than planned. I sat on a fallen log and pulled my pant leg up. The muscle was tight and tender, the skin warm to the touch. Not injured enough to stop, just injured enough to be inconvenient. "I can tape it," one of them offered, already digging into the first aid kit. They did it carefully, professionally. No jokes, no pressure. When I stood, it helped, just enough. "Let us know if it gets worse," someone said. I nodded. We walked on. The afternoon clouds came in faster than expected. The light flattened, turning the forest into layers of gray and green. The trail markers were harder to spot. We slowed again, checking directions more often. That was when I noticed the glances. Quick, unintentional. People checking the distance ahead, then back at me. Not annoyed, just measuring. We were still moving, still together, still saying the right things. But the math had started. And even then, I didn't think it applied to me. The weather changed faster than anyone expected. By mid-afternoon, the clouds dropped lower, thickening until the forest felt compressed beneath them. The air turned damp and heavy. A fine mist started to fall. Not rain exactly, but enough to darken the trail and make every surface slick. My leg didn't like it. Each step downhill sent a dull shock through the muscle. I could still walk, but the margin for error was gone. One slip would mean a real injury, not something I could tape and ignore. We checked the map again. The next campsite was farther than we'd planned to be at that hour. The turnoff for the shorter route back sat behind us now, already lost in fog and trees. Going forward meant committing to another long stretch before shelter. We stopped in the middle of the trail. No one said it out loud at first, but I could feel the calculation happening around me. Head counts, distances, daylight left. One of them asked how I was doing. I told the truth. "I can keep moving," I said, "just slower." No one argued with that. "That storm isn't supposed to hit until tonight," someone else said, scanning the sky. "But if it rolls in early..." They didn't finish the sentence. Another suggested splitting gear to lighten my load. They shifted weight from my pack to theirs without asking. It helped, but it also made something clear. I was the variable now. We reached a small clearing just off the trail, a place you'd only notice if you were already looking for somewhere to stop. Flat enough for one tent, some cover from the trees, not marked on the map. This could work, someone said, just for the night. They looked at me when they said it. The idea sounded reasonable, smart even. Let me rest. Let the storm pass. Reassess in the morning. I asked how far the next campsite was from there. A pause. Too far to make it before dark, someone answered. Not with the weather. I nodded slowly. No one said the word alone, but the space between us felt wider than it had all day. We all knew what this place was, and why it was suddenly an option. No one said it directly. They started by unpacking. One tent came out of a pack and went up quickly, practiced hands working without discussion. Someone handed me a headlamp and an extra bottle of water. Another set a small pile of food beside the tent, enough for a night, maybe two. It all happened efficiently, kindly, too kindly. I asked what the plan was. "We'll hike out," one of them said, adjusting a strap. "Get to the ranger station before the storm really hits. Come back with help first thing in the morning." They said it like a schedule, like logistics, not like a decision that needed agreement. I looked at each of them, waiting for someone to meet my eyes and say something different. No one did. The fog thickened while we stood there, dulling the edges of the trees and swallowing the trail behind us. The light was already fading, the forest dimming into early evening. I asked how long it would take them to get back. "Depends on the weather," someone said, "but we won't be long." I asked who would stay with me. That question landed heavier than I expected. A few seconds passed. Someone cleared their throat. Another zipped their jacket higher. "It's safer if we don't split up," one of them said finally. "We'll move faster." They were right. I knew that. That was the worst part. They helped me into the tent, checked the zipper, made sure the stakes were tight. One of them knelt and retaped my leg, careful not to hurt me. "Stay put," they said. "Don't try to move." I nodded because arguing felt pointless now. They slung their packs on and stood there for a moment, all of them together. Someone said my name. Someone else promised they'd be back. Then they turned and walked away. I watched their headlamps bob through the fog until the light thinned and disappeared. The forest closed in immediately after. The silence that followed wasn't sudden. It crept in, filling the space they'd left behind, settling into the clearing until it felt permanent. I was alone. Not because something terrible had happened, but because everyone had agreed this was the safest choice. Night came down fast. The fog thickened until the trees beyond the clearing vanished completely. The headlamp on my forehead felt weak. Its beam swallowed a few feet out, leaving the rest of the forest untouched and unknowable. I checked my watch. They'd been gone less than 30 minutes. I told myself that mattered. I shifted inside the tent, trying to find a position that didn't pull at my leg. Every movement sent a dull pulse of pain up my calf. Not sharp enough to panic over, just enough to keep me awake. The temperature dropped again. I layered everything I had on top of me and waited for the familiar sounds of other people nearby. Voices, footsteps, the small, comforting noises that prove you're not alone. There were none. Somewhere in the dark, something moved, not close, just close enough to hear branches bend and release. I held my breath until the sound faded, then let it out slowly, counting the seconds like I'd been taught. I checked the trail. No lights. An hour passed, then another. I stopped guessing how long it would take them to reach help. Stopped telling myself stories about what they were doing right now. The silence stretched in a way that made time feel unreliable. My legs started to cramp as the cold set in. I tried to massage it through my pants, careful not to move too much. The pain blurred into a deeper ache, the kind that makes your thoughts slow and circular. That was when I realized something I hadn't let myself think about yet. They hadn't told me when they'd be back. Not a time, not a distance, just a promise, shaped like reassurance. The fog pressed closer, dampening sound until even my own breathing felt distant. I turned my headlamp off to save the battery and lay there in the dark, listening to my heartbeat. I pictured the parking lot, warm cars, phones with signal, the relief of being safe again. I wondered how far they'd have to get before turning back felt impossible. At some point, I stopped listening for footsteps. I started listening for morning instead. We arrived later than we should have. The sky was already darkening when we pulled into the campground. That dull blue-gray light settling in that tells you night is coming whether you're ready or not. Most of the sites were quiet. A few RVs sat dark and closed, like they'd already gone to sleep. At the entrance, a single utility truck was parked beside the office. A man in a reflective jacket waved us down before we could even shut the engine off. "Check-in's quick," he said, "but listen carefully." He spoke calmly, practiced, like he'd said the same thing many times before. "There's been some activity tonight," he continued. "Nothing you need to worry about if you follow instructions." That sentence should have bothered me more than it did. He pointed toward the trees lining the campground. The forest looked thicker in the fading light, shadows already pooling between the trunks. "If you hear anything after dark," he said, "stay in your tent, don't walk around. Don't come looking for anyone." I asked what kind of activity he meant. He shook his head slightly. "Doesn't matter, just stay put until morning." There was a radio clipped to his jacket. The speaker crackled once, then went quiet. "Is it wildlife?" my partner asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes it's people." That was all the explanation we got. He handed us a site number and stepped back, already turning his attention to another car pulling in behind us. We drove to our spot in silence. Our campsite sat near the edge of the loop, close to the trees. The ground was level, the fire ring cold and unused. Everything looked normal, safe, almost welcoming. We set up fast, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from camping together before. The last light drained from the sky as we zipped the tent closed. Before crawling inside, I glanced back toward the campground road. The office light was still on. The man in the reflective jacket stood near his truck, facing the trees, his radio pressed to his ear. Then the light flicked off, and the campground settled into a silence that felt instructed. We didn't sleep right away. The campground went quiet too quickly, like someone had flipped a switch instead of letting night settle in naturally. No laughter, no late footsteps, not even the usual sounds of people getting comfortable in their tents, just stillness. Sometime after midnight, a noise cut through it. Metal, not loud, not crashing, just a slow dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across gravel. It came from deeper in the campground, somewhere past the trees. I sat up, listening. It stopped. A few seconds passed. Then it started again, closer this time. My partner whispered my name. I could hear the tension in their voice, the way it flattened when they were trying not to panic. I reached for the zipper, then stopped. The man's words replayed in my head. "Stay in your tent." The sound moved again. A pause. Then a soft, sharp knock. Not on our tent, somewhere else, followed by another, and another. A light flicked on across the loop. One of the other tents, just a dim glow, barely visible through the fog. I watched the silhouette inside shift. Someone sitting up the way I had. I expected shouting, questions, someone breaking the silence. None came. The radio on the small table outside the campground office crackled faintly, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the still air. Then a voice came through. "Remain in your tents," it said. Calm, male, familiar. "Do not approach anyone outside." No explanation. The light across the loop snapped off. The dragging sound resumed, slower now, more deliberate. I pressed my ear against the tent wall, trying to place it. Every instinct told me to look, to confirm what was making that noise, to do something. Instead, I sat there in the dark, following the rule we'd been given. Because so far, nothing bad had happened, and that made the order feel justified. For now. The radio came back on less than 10 minutes later. This time, the volume was higher. "Remain inside your tents," the voice said again. "Do not attempt to leave your sight. This is for your safety." It was the same man, same calm tone, same confidence, but something underneath it had changed. The pauses were shorter, the words more precise, like he was reading from something instead of choosing what to say. I whispered that I wanted to look. My partner shook their head immediately, not aggressively, just once. Enough. Outside, the dragging sound stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing at all. Then someone screamed. It was distant, muffled by fog and trees, but unmistakably human. A single sharp sound that cut off as abruptly as it started. I was already reaching for the zipper when the radio crackled again. "Stay where you are," the voice said, faster now. "Help is on the way." I froze with my hand on the fabric. Across the campground, another light turned on. Then another, small, weak glows appearing one by one, each contained within thin walls of nylon and fear. No one came out. The scream didn't happen again. Instead, I heard movement, footsteps this time, heavy, multiple, passing somewhere between the trees and the road, too coordinated to be wildlife, too many to be one person. A shape passed through the fog beyond our tent, tall, close enough that I could hear breathing, slow, controlled. I held my breath until my chest hurt. The radio stayed silent. Minutes passed, then more. When the voice finally returned, it sounded composed again, almost relieved. "The situation is contained," it said. "Remain inside your tents until morning." Contained. I realized then that the instructions weren't meant to protect us from what was outside. They were meant to keep us from becoming part of it. I waited until the radio went quiet again before I moved. Very slowly, I shifted toward the tent wall and pressed my ear against it. The fog outside dulled everything, but I could still hear the campground breathing, canvas rustling, a zipper somewhere being pulled halfway and stopped, the low idle of an engine far off. An engine. I looked at my partner. They nodded once. We didn't unzip the door. We peeled it back just enough to see. The road that looped past our site was blocked. A fallen tree lay across it, thick and fresh, branches still wet and bright where they'd snapped. Beyond it, a truck sat sideways, hazard lights off, like it had been parked in a hurry and abandoned. I couldn't tell if it was the same utility truck from the office. I tried the car. The key turned. The dash lights came on. The engine clicked and died. I tried again. Same result. Cold spread through my stomach. Not panic yet, but certainty. The kind that arrives quietly and doesn't leave. The radio crackled. "If you're listening," the voice said, softer now, "do not attempt to leave the campground." I realized he hadn't said our site. He'd said the campground. I asked why. For a few seconds there was only static. Then the reply came, measured and careful. "For your safety." I scanned the trees. The fog pressed low and heavy, hiding the spaces between trunks where movement could disappear without sound. Somewhere deeper in, something metallic scraped once and went still. A tent across the loop collapsed suddenly, poles snapping inward as if someone had grabbed it from the outside and pulled. No scream this time. The radio stayed silent. I understood then that the rules weren't temporary. They weren't waiting for morning to lift. They were waiting for whatever was happening to finish. And staying inside wasn't a choice anymore. It was the perimeter. We didn't decide right away. That was the mistake. Every instinct told me that staying still was no longer the safer option. But breaking a rule you've been following all night feels heavier than it should. The longer you obey, the harder it is to stop. Another voice came over the radio. Not the same man this time. Younger, tighter. "All campers," it said. "Remain inside your tents. Do not respond to outside voices. Do not assist anyone attempting to leave." My partner stared at me in the dark. "Did he just say not to help?" they whispered. I nodded. Outside, footsteps approached. Slow, careful. They stopped just beyond the edge of our headlamp's reach. I could hear breathing again, closer now, uneven, like someone trying to stay quiet and failing. A voice followed. "Please," it said. Hoarse, human. They told me to stay too. My tent. The sentence cut off with a wet sound and a sudden weight against the side of our tent. The radio came alive instantly. "Do not engage," the first voice said. "Calm again. Controlled. Remain inside." I felt my partner's hand grip my arm, nails digging through fabric. My heart was hammering hard enough that I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. The shape shifted, dragging along the tent wall, pulling at a guy line hard enough to make the poles flex. I could smell sweat, dirt, something metallic. This was the moment. Stay and become invisible, or move and be seen. I reached for the zipper. The radio crackled once more. "If you leave your tent," the voice said quietly, "we can't guarantee your safety." I thought of the collapsed tent across the loop, of the scream that stopped too fast, of the rule that had already failed at least one person. I pulled the zipper down. Cold air rushed in, thick with fog and something sour underneath it. Behind us, someone else screamed, and this time it was much closer. If you made it to the end, then you already know something most people don't like to admit. Fear doesn't always come from what's chasing you. Sometimes it comes from the moment you realize that the rules you trusted were never meant to save you. Every story tonight ended quietly. No explanations, no clear villains, just people trying to survive inside systems that failed them. If any of these stories felt uncomfortably real, that's because they were built from decisions people actually make. Before you close this video, ask yourself one thing. If you were there, would you have stayed or would you have left? The next story is waiting.